The door didn't crash open. There was no dramatic chase, no blaring sirens in the street below. Just a quiet knock in the middle of an ordinary day. The kind of knock you expect from a delivery driver or a neighbor. And in that single, unremarkable moment, two ordinary lives shifted forever. Before that day, everything about their world looked normal from the outside. The flat sat quietly among rows of similar buildings. No flashy cars, no late-night noise, no signs of the kind of life people associate with serious crime. Inside those walls lived two young mothers, managing routines that revolved around children, meals, school schedules, messages from family, and the endless pressure of trying to stay afloat in a world that doesn't slow down for anyone. Their days were shaped by budgets, bills, and future worries that sat quietly in the background of every small decision. Nothing about their lives suggested danger. Nothing suggested headlines. Nothing suggested police. And yet, behind that ordinary surface, pressure had been building for a long time. It didn't arrive as one big problem. It arrived in layers. Rent that needed covering, costs that kept rising, responsibilities that didn't pause when money ran thin. Stress has a way of shrinking the future until only the next bill matters. Hope becomes short-term, planning becomes survival. And when survival sets the rules, choices begin to change shape. There were no shadowy figures lurking in alleyways, no dramatic recruitment into a criminal world. The path began quietly, through conversations that felt practical rather than dangerous, small opportunities framed as solutions, temporary fixes, just for now. Each step was presented as manageable, controlled, and safe. And when everything looks controlled, it doesn't feel reckless, it feels calculated. At first, nothing seemed to change. The same routines continued. Children were still dropped off, groceries were still bought, family messages still pinged phones. The outside world remained unaware because the inside world didn't yet feel chaotic. And that's how these situations take root. They hide inside routine. They survive inside habit. Over time, however, the pressure didn't disappear, it simply shifted location. Instead of sitting openly on unpaid bills and financial worry, it moved inwards. It lived in constant awareness, in checking messages more often, in listening more closely to sounds outside the door, in that subtle tension that never fully quiets. Neither woman saw herself as part of a criminal world. In their minds, this wasn't identity, it was circumstance. It was something that existed alongside motherhood, not instead of it. And that separation mattered to them. It allowed the situation to continue without fully confronting what it meant. Days passed, then weeks. The imagined turning point, the moment when it would end, kept moving further ahead. Always after one more job, always after one more payout. The future became a promise that never arrived. Inside the flat, life existed in two layers. The visible layer was routine. Children's toys, cups on countertops, the steady rhythm of domestic life. Beneath it existed a second layer built on secrecy, silence, and careful timing. The two layers never truly merged, but they constantly touched, and every time they touched, the risk grew. Fear rarely enters all at once. It increases in increments, first as awareness, then as unease, then as alertness, then as anticipation. The mind adapts to living in that state so gradually that it can begin to feel normal. And when fear becomes normal, it loses its power to warn. What they didn't know, what few ever know in moments like these, is how long they had already been watched. Investigations don't begin with arrests. They begin with observation, patterns, small irregularities noticed by people trained to notice the unnoticed. Quiet movements that mean nothing to those living them, but everything to those tracking from the outside. While life inside the flat followed routines, a separate timeline was unfolding quietly alongside it. That Friday began like any other. Plans for lunch, messages exchanged, ordinary expectations. There was no sense that this day would be different from the last. And that's what made the moment so devastating. It arrived without preparation. When the knock came, there was no rush to answer, no panic yet, just confusion, a pause. Then the door opened. What happened next unfolded without raised voices, without chaos, without spectacle. Calm instructions, calm movements, calm professionalism. The room that had always felt private, familiar, and controlled suddenly belonged to strangers following a procedure that could not be undone. Shock doesn't always feel dramatic. Often it feels slow, heavy. Disbelief stretches time. Every movement feels unreal, as if happening just slightly out of reach. The reality of what had been living quietly inside that flat no longer belonged to secrecy. What had once been hidden in ordinary spaces became impossible to ignore. And in that moment, both women were forced to face the truth they had carefully kept at arm's length, that circumstance had become something far more permanent. The weight of that realization is difficult to describe. It isn't fear alone, it is the collapse of illusion, the sudden understanding that life, as it had been imagined even the day before, no longer exists. There were no dramatic speeches, no final justifications that made everything make sense, just a growing awareness that every decision, once distant and compartmentalized, had now arrived all at once. Time slowed, thoughts scattered. What about the children? What about family? What about the future that had been postponed again and again? In moments like this, consequences don't arrive as a neat sequence. They arrive as an overwhelming wall of possibility all at once. The outside world would soon attach labels to their story, headlines, figures, summaries. But inside that flat, the experience wasn't numbers or charges. It was shock, disbelief, and a quiet breaking awareness that whatever came next would be lived far from the life they once knew. What followed was not immediate clarity. It was confusion, long hours, questions, waiting, the uncomfortable stillness between moments of understanding, the kind of waiting where time no longer moves in minutes, but in thoughts. And as reality set in, so did reflection. The mind begins its slow rewind. The moments that once felt harmless are re-examined. The conversations that once felt practical are now heavy with meaning. Regret doesn't arrive as one emotion, it arrives as a chain of if-onlys. If one decision had been different, if one step had been delayed, if one boundary had remained intact, but if only cannot reshape what is already real. For both women, identity shifted overnight, not because they had suddenly changed, but because the world around them now saw them through a different lens. The roles of mother, daughter, friend, all still existed, but they were now layered with a label that they would carry forward into every future moment. The hardest truth of stories like this is not found in law or punishment. It is found in consequence that extends outwards. Families affected, children impacted, relationships altered, trust reshaped. The ripple spreads far beyond the original decision. And this is the part rarely captured by headlines, the quiet aftermath, the long thinking, the slow reckoning with how ordinary life became extraordinary in the worst possible way. How pressure turned into risk, how risk turned into reality. The story of two young mums caught in a moment is not just a story about crime. It is a story about vulnerability under pressure, about how ordinary people can drift into worlds they never imagined entering, about how survival can slowly rewrite values without announcing that it's doing so. What remains long after the noise fades is not the shock of the arrest, but the echo of everything that led up to it. And it is in that echo
that the true weight of the story lives.
And it is from that echo that the next turning point quietly emerges, the moment when routine collapses into revelation, and the future stops being something distant and suddenly becomes something immediate. Because the moment that changes everything rarely announces itself with warning. It arrives disguised as normal, as habit, as expectation. That Friday began with ordinary intentions, a time set for lunch, messages exchanged with casual familiarity, thoughts occupied with everyday responsibilities. Nothing in the air suggested that this was the day when the invisible weight would finally become visible. Routine is powerful because it convinces us that tomorrow will look like today. And when tomorrow does not follow that rule, the shock is not just about surprise, it is about betrayal of assumption. The human mind leans on consistency for comfort. When that consistency breaks, even for a moment, the ground feels unstable. Inside the flat, the hours passed without ceremony. Movements were familiar. The rooms held the same shapes, the same light through the windows, the same sounds from outside. There was nothing to signal that invisible lines were tightening. And yet, beyond those walls, another world was already in motion, one that didn't announce itself through intuition or instinct, one that moved through observation, documentation, and quiet coordination. While one timeline lived on habit, the other advanced on structure. When the knock finally came, it didn't carry the sound of danger. No urgency, no raised voices, just firmness, professional calm. The kind of calm that doesn't ask, it informs. The first second after the door opened did not feel real. The mind hesitates in moments like that. It creates a brief pocket of disbelief because accepting the truth all at once would be too heavy. So instead, shock introduces itself gradually. Words are heard, but not fully processed. Movements are seen, but not fully understood. The room begins to feel smaller, even though nothing in it has changed. And in that shift of perception, the space that once felt safe no longer belongs to its occupants in the same way. Suddenly, routine is replaced by instruction. Sit here, wait, answer when spoken to. The body follows before the mind catches up. There is a strange stillness that follows moments like this, the kind of stillness that is louder than panic. It is the stillness of realization spreading slowly through thought, the awareness that something permanent is unfolding. As the invisible becomes visible, what had once been carefully separated from daily life now stands openly inside it. The separation that once allowed denial no longer exists. And with that disappearance comes a flood of thoughts that do not speak out loud. How did it come to this? How did something that began as a temporary solution become the center of everything? It is at this point that people often expect collapse, tears, panic, dramatic reaction, but more often it is silence that dominates. The mind narrows. It focuses only on what must be done in the next minute. Emotional protection turns inward. What makes moments like this so heavy is not only what is happening, it is what is being realized. The future that had been postponed, reshaped, and continually deferred suddenly demands an answer. There is no more later. Later has arrived. Time takes on a different behavior in moments like this. Seconds stretch. Minutes feel distorted. Each movement is watched. Each pause feels like an hour. The ordinary objects in the room, the sofa, the table, the cups, the toys, remain exactly where they were. But their meaning changes. The space no longer represents routine. It becomes memory in the making. And the mind, seeking control, begins to organize what it can. Who will look after the children? Who needs to be told? What will family think? What will tomorrow look like? These questions arrive before answers exist. There is a peculiar kind of isolation that forms even in a room filled with people. It is the isolation of knowing that what you are experiencing, no one else in that moment is feeling in the same way. The world feels divided between those who know and those who do not. As the reality deepens, so does the awareness that this is no longer just a personal moment. It is now part of a public process. Decisions will be made that no longer belong to the individuals at the center of them. Control, which once felt delicate but present, disappears almost completely. What follows is waiting. Waiting that feels heavier than action. Waiting that leaves space for thought to run without limits. Waiting that teaches just how loud silence can be. In that waiting, the narrative of how did this happen begins to shape itself piece by piece. The mind retraces steps, looking for a misstep large enough to explain everything. It revisits moments that once felt small, conversations that once felt forgettable. Each is examined with a new lens. But stories like this rarely turn on single moments. They turn on patterns, on gradual shifts, on repeated compromises that do not look serious at the time. The turning point, the moment everything changes, is rarely one decision. It is the accumulation of many that are only recognized as dangerous in hindsight. For the outside world, the story will later be summarized in a line or two. Names, figures, locations. A snapshot of an event. But living inside the moment reveals how much weight exists between those lines. How many emotions, calculations, fears, and realizations are packed into what later becomes a headline. Hours later, or what feels like hours, the understanding begins to sharpen. The situation is no longer abstract. It is defined. It has shape. It has consequence. And with that clarity comes a new kind of fear. Not of discovery, but of outcome. Outcome is heavier than risk, because risk allows imagination. Outcome does not. This is when reflection begins to deepen. The mind, seeking stability, starts anchoring itself to memories of before pressure dominated, before secrets grew heavy, before the future began to feel negotiated instead of chosen. What once felt like survival now feels like a miscalculation of scale. And this is also when guilt often takes its quietest but most powerful form. Not loud self-blame, but persistent wondering what could have been done differently, wondering how many people will be affected next. The families will soon know. The children will be impacted. The circle widens whether anyone wants it to or not. This is the true reach of turning points. They rarely stop with the individuals involved. They ripple outward to people who never made the original choices, but now live with their effects. And yet, even at this stage, the mind still searches for complexity because simplicity feels unbearable. It would be easier to believe that something dramatic caused all of this. A villain, a single moment of recklessness, a sudden break in character. But the truth is quieter and more uncomfortable. It is that the situation grew slowly. It made room for itself. It adapted to the environment it entered. And by the time it demanded full attention, it had already become part of the structure of life. This realization is often the hardest to sit with, that no single dramatic act began the story, only ordinary decisions made under ordinary pressure. As the first phase of shock fades, a different awareness settles in. The understanding that explanations will now be given not only to others,
but to self. That identity, once maintained in private and public, must now be rebuilt under scrutiny. The turning point is not only external, it is internal. It marks the divide between life as it was believed to be and life as it must now be understood. And standing at that divide, there is no clear direction forward. Only process, only time, only unfolding consequence. Because once the moment arrives, there is no reversing it, only moving through it. And moving through it changes everything.